Today I'd have to title the message, The Tale of Two Sons. Not two cities, but two sons. Because today we see in chapter 21 of the book of Genesis the birth of Isaac, the promised son, the son that would come from Sarah and Abraham and not from Abraham and Hagar. It's quite an interesting story because we see two sons, both of them Abraham's sons, but only one Sarah and Abraham's son, the son of promise, the son by faith and not by sight. Let me say that again for you. Ishmael came about because of the lack of faith and wanting to see the results of God's promise by sight. And so Sarah took things into her own hands and brought about a son of sight. Well, Abraham and Sarah waited some 14 years. They had a son named Isaac, a son of faith, one promised by God. God's timetable doesn't always run on our timetable. Abraham was 86 when Ishmael was born, and he was 100 when Isaac was born, 14 years. Yes, it's a wonderful promise to see God's promises fulfilled, and it's wonderful to see the obedience of Abraham naming the child Isaac, and by circumcising him at 8 days, as was called for in the covenant, chapter 17, verses 12 through 19. And we find Sarah getting some amusement, but this time not amusement in disbelief, amusement in the fact that she knew everybody would just be absolutely dumbstruck at the fact that she, in her old age, could not only have a child and nurse a child, but that her husband at 100 years of age could have a child. And so we find very clearly in verse 6 through 7, Sarah says, now people can laugh with me, not at me, and not in disbelief, but they can laugh with me. It's good that Sarah kept her sense of humor and recognized that God's promises are faithful. However, we find that Sarah still has a thorn in her side because of Hagar and Ishmael. Hagar's an Egyptian, and she's the one that suggested it. That is, Sarah is the one that suggested it, that Abraham take her as his wife and have a child with her. But now, here in chapter 21, she wants to drive her out. You can imagine Abraham's dilemma. You can't bear children and not love them. And Abraham loved Ishmael just like he loved Isaac. So he was troubled by the fact that he was being told to drive her out along with her son. But God's a good God, isn't he? And it comes very clearly in verse 12 that God came to Abraham and said, it's okay. Do what Sarah said. It'll be okay. I'm going to make Isaac a great nation, but I'm also going to make Ishmael a great nation. And so Abraham, again in obedience, takes some bread and some water, and he sends Hagar out into the wilderness. When the water runs out and the bread runs out, Hagar is troubled, and she sets a boy under a bush, and she cries out, I don't want to watch my boy die, and she wept. But again, God's graciousness and God's goodness in verses 17 and 18 sends an angel to Hagar and says, do not fear. You're going to find that phrase repeats itself many, many times in the scriptures. Do not fear. God has heard you. He will make your son a great nation. Then he opened her eyes so that she could see a well of water. She refilled her water containers, gave Ishmael a drink. Ishmael grew and became an archer, and Hagar arranged for her to have, for him to have an Egyptian wife. It's an interesting story, the story of two sons. Abraham loved them both. And God obviously cared about Hagar, cared about Ishmael, cared about Isaac, cared about Abraham, cared about Sarah. And he's with them all, watching over them, allowing all of the events to play out. But I'll always remember the tale of two sons, one that came about by sight and one that came about by faith. And the difference in the promises was that Isaac would be a great nation, a God-fearing nation. Oh, they would stumble and fall quite a few times along the way, but God's hand would always be on them. Whereas the Egyptian woman, her Egyptian half-son, half Egyptian and half Hebrew, he would be a great nation, but that nation would not have the same blessings that God had placed on the nation of Israel. A son by sight and a son by faith. We're to live by faith, not by sight. We're to be obedient to God. And even when we do things that are not exactly perfect in God's eyes, he still shows his mercy and grace. And I'm thankful for that, because I'm anywhere far from perfect. And that's my thought for the day. God bless you and have a great day.